The wind came down from the northern ridge like a living thing. It whipped across the dry plains, rolling red dust into thick veils before slamming against the face of the man standing on the wooden porch. Elior Grant pulled his hat lower and squinted toward the winding dirt road that led to the ranch. A wagon was coming. Its wheels bit into the hard earth, carving crooked lines like stitches across the skin of the land. When it stopped, the driver pointed to the back without a word. The door opened, and a woman stepped down. Her cloak was heavy with dust, her dark dress tugged by the wind. But what caught Elior's eye wasn't her weariness or the worn shoes. It was her gaze. Steady, clear, without plea. "Mr. Grant?" Her voice was low, roughened by the wind. He nodded, said nothing. "I was told you needed help through the winter." "Maybe," he said, still looking past her toward the open field. "But I don't hire long, just till the snow's gone." "That'll do," she answered, gripping the strap of her canvas bag. A long silence followed. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of pine and burnt wood. Elior lit a cigarette. "Your name?" "Mara Hayes." "Where'd you come from?" "Helena. Took the train, then a wagon half a day out. They said you don't like folks who talk too much." He almost smiled. They said right. She studied him, eyes sharp as flint. "Good. I don't either." Then, after a beat, her voice dropped, low but unshaken. "And that's why I came. You don't hire women who cry, do you?" Elior froze. The ash fell, lost in the wind. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter," she said. "I just want work. No pity. Just a place to last the winter." He looked at her a long time. Black hair tangled with the wind, hands calloused, face sun-browned yet proud. Not beautiful in the way men turned their heads, but in the way they stood a little straighter when she walked by. She didn't bow, didn't pretend to be brave. She simply stood there, waiting. Elior turned away, his voice rough. "Ain't had anyone in this house for 3 years. If you can handle the cold and the quiet, you can stay." "How long?" "A month. We'll see after." She nodded, no thanks given. When he stepped inside, he heard her footsteps follow, measured, steady, neither slow nor hurried. The house opened to the scent of old wood and cold ashes. Fading light spilled through the window, dust shimmering in its path. A chipped clay cup still sat on the table, unwashed for weeks. Mara set her bag down, rolled up her sleeves, and asked, "Where's the broom?" Elior frowned. "You just got here. No need to start right off." "You asked me to stay, not to sit," she said, and walked straight into the kitchen. He watched her go, listened to the cupboard doors creak open, the muted clatter of wood and tin. The house that had forgotten sound began to stir again, not with noise, but with life. When the sun dipped, Elior stepped onto the porch and lit the oil lamp. The wind was softer now. From the kitchen came the faint glow of light and the smell of bread warming. He didn't call to her, didn't step inside. Just stood there, listening to the spoon tap against a pot, the warmth slipping quietly through the boards. By nightfall, he sat alone at the window, gazing over the dark hills. For 3 years, the only sounds in that house had been wind and horses. Tonight, there was another rhythm, light, human, steady, like a forgotten heartbeat remembering its way back. He closed his eyes, exhaled. Somewhere in the dark, she was still awake, still working, wordless as the snow beyond the door. and for the first time in years, Elior realized silence could breathe. On the first morning, when Elior stepped out onto the porch, dew still clung to the grass, and a thin line of smoke curled up from the kitchen. He paused on the steps, listening, the faint stir of a spoon in a pot, a window opening to let the air in, and a hum without words, soft and low, like wind brushing through birch leaves. Mara was there, by the stove. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, wrists browned by the sun, the hem of her skirt swaying slightly as she moved. She didn't rush. Every motion had its own quiet rhythm, as if the house had always known how to breathe, but had simply waited for someone to remind it. When Elior walked in, she didn't turn. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice no louder than ash falling. "Yeah." She poured, set the cup before him. He touched the clay. It was warm. A drop slid over his finger, hot enough to sting, but he didn't pull back. The burn was a strange comfort, proof that this house was no longer hollow. All day, he worked outside near the stables while she moved through the rooms, kitchen, attic, windows, clearing years of dust with slow, deliberate hands. He didn't speak, only glanced through the fogged glass now and then, catching her shadow as it passed through strips of sunlight and dust. The way she wiped each table, hung new curtains, mended an old quilt. There was weight in her quietness, a grace that couldn't be taught. When he brought in a stack of firewood, she looked up from the hearth and said softly, "This house isn't ugly. It's just sad." Elior stopped at the door, his hand still gripping the wood. He wanted to answer, but only muttered, "Sad suits it." She shook her head. "Nothing's born to be sad." The words stayed with him until dusk. As the sun sank behind the hills, the smell of baked bread drifted through the kitchen, mingling with the faint scent of burning wood. Elior stood at the threshold, his shadow long across the floorboards. Mara didn't see him, or pretended not to. She lifted the pan from the oven, the cloth thick in her hands, heat rising against her skin and coloring it softly pink. When she turned, the golden light brushed her neck, traced the curve of her shoulder. Elior's hand found the doorframe, leaving a faint mark in the dust. A touch that wasn't quite a touch, just the echo of one. She glanced up and caught his gaze. Neither spoke. Then Mara smiled, barely. "If you want a slice, you'll have to wait till it cools." Elior cleared his throat, turned away. "I'm not hungry." But when she turned back to the bread, he didn't move. He listened to the scrape of the knife, the sound of crust breaking, and breathed in the sweetness that filled the air, a scent that made the quiet feel almost dangerous. Later, as the sky turned rust red, he led her to the back field. "Out here," he said, "it's not just wolves you should worry about. You'll need to know how to shoot." Mara frowned, slightly, but didn't argue. He handed her an old Winchester, his fingers brushing hers. Her hands trembled. Her eyes did not. "Hold it firm," he murmured, stepping behind her, adjusting her stance. His arm came around her, the warmth of him crossing through the thick fabric. "Don't look at the barrel. Look where you mean to hit. And if I miss, then you try again." The gun cracked through the cold air. Smoke rose, curling into the fading light. The shot went wide, but barely. Elior looked down, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "Not bad for a first." "No need to flatter me," she said. "I'll hit the mark." He said nothing, but in his eyes She was no longer the hired help. She was something steadier, harder to define, something he couldn't look away from. She fired again. The bullet struck dead center. When the smoke cleared, he realized his hand was still on her arm. They both stilled, breath mingling in the chill air. She spoke quietly, a hint of dry humor beneath her calm. "You forgot to let go." He stepped back, voice rough. "Out here," he said, "fear gets you killed. But too much fear makes you forget you're alive." Mara followed his gaze toward the horizon, where the last light fell across the red earth like sifted ash, and in that moment she understood. This man wasn't afraid of the wind. He was afraid of anything that stayed close long enough to feel it. That afternoon, the sky changed color like fevered skin. From the mountains, clouds rolled in thick and black, and the wind swept across the fields, bending the grass as if the land itself were bowing to something greater. Elior looked up and knew the storm was near. He tightened the reins, called the horses in, the crack of his whip sharp and anxious, like a heart trying not to fall behind. On the porch, Mara was gathering laundry. The dark hem of her skirt whipped in the wind, her hair flying loose, curling around her sun-browned face. When the first lightning split the sky, he shouted, but the wind swallowed his voice whole. She clutched the bundle in her arms and ran toward him. Together they forced the door shut just as thunder shook the air. Inside, the lamplight flickered. The fire in the hearth threw their shadows against the wall, wavering like two lost souls unsure where to lean. The door rattled in its frame. The roof groaned as though the house itself were breathing through pain. Mara braced herself against the table, eyes tracing the trembling beams above, breath shallow and uneven. Elior watched her, the way her hands gripped the wet fabric, water dripping from her fingers to the floor in trembling beads. "Will the house hold?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He glanced around, listening to the creaks and moans in the wood, then said quietly, "If it's still making noise, it's still fighting." She frowned, unsure she'd heard right. "What do you mean?" Elior met her eyes, the firelight flickering across the dark amber of his gaze. "A noisy house isn't weak," he said slowly. "It's fighting for us." Mara said nothing. She looked at him for a long time before bowing her head, letting the words seep into her like rain through dry soil. Outside, the downpour roared across the roof, but beneath the chaos, another rhythm stirred. Something faint and human, a shared heartbeat between two survivors and the place that sheltered them. They sat side by side near the hearth. She spoke quietly of the rains in Helena, of a leaking roof and a husband who kept trying to light damp wood until the smoke choked them both. Elior listened, wordless. When she finished, he rose, fetched a thick blanket, and draped it over her shoulders. His hand brushed her collar, warmth spreading up the back of her neck. She murmured a soft, "Thank you." He didn't answer. The fire flickered between them, and for a moment, they looked less like strangers and more like two people remembering the same ache. The night stretched long. Rain battered the windows, wind howled through the cracks, but neither of them slept. Elior sat at the table repairing a broken board. She stitched a torn curtain by the fire. They didn't need to speak. The sound of his hammer and her needle found each other, two different rhythms, breathing the same silence. When the storm finally passed, only soft rain remained, and the air was thick with the scent of wet wood. Mara's shoulders eased, her eyes bright again, as though some old fear had washed away. Elior noticed, but said nothing. He didn't know how to speak without breaking the quiet they had built. By morning, the sky was pale gray. The earth was soaked, fences fallen, the barn door torn from its hinges. Mara stepped outside, lifting her skirt above the mud, while Elior carried rope and nails. "If you're fixing it," she said, "I'm helping." "You don't have to." She smiled faintly. No one should stand still after a storm. They worked until the sun climbed. Mud clung to her sleeves, hair stuck to her forehead, and each time she held a plank steady, their fingers brushed. Sweat, earth, and breath mixed into a silence that was no longer lonely, but shared. When it was done, they sat on the porch, facing the shining fields. The sun had broken through, laying a silver line across the wet ground. Mara handed him a cup of water. Their fingers met briefly, stopping both of them for half a breath. "You were right," she said softly. "This house isn't weak." Elior turned to her, nodding once. It just needed someone willing to listen when it cried. That night, when the walls had dried and the lamps burned low, Elior lay awake, listening. No wind, no rattling beams, only the faint sound of footsteps crossing the floor. Slow, gentle, real. He didn't rise, just listened. The steps paused in the hallway, then faded into quiet. And in that quiet, Elior realized, for the first time in years, he was not the only one in the house who knew how to breathe. That night was colder than the ones before. The wind slid through the chimney, howling like a voice from another world. Elior stirred the fire, feeding it small pieces of wood until it caught. The flames snapped softly, their light pulsing against the wall like the faint rhythm of a heart. Mara sat a few feet away, hands tucked beneath a thick blanket, eyes fixed on the fire, though they seemed to look past it. For a long while, neither spoke. Only wind and breathing filled the room. Then her voice broke the stillness, low, steady, as though she were speaking to a memory rather than to him. "My husband died in a fire." Elior looked up. The light caught half her face, one side bright, the other lost to shadow, like a wound still healing. "He worked at a lumber mill," she went on. "One night the kiln caught flame. Everyone ran. He went back, because I was still inside the back room." Her voice faltered there. Each word weighted heavier than breath. "He got me out. When I woke, there was only smoke and ash left." She spoke plainly. No tremor, no tears. But Elior knew there were losses too deep for crying. His gaze fell to her hands, sun-darkened, calloused, the kind of hands that worked hard just to stay too busy to remember. After a while, he said quietly, "I had someone too." Her head turned slightly. "A fiancé?" He nodded, eyes on the fire. "She left a week before the wedding. No explanation, just a letter. I found out later she'd gone with a banker. I don't blame her. Everyone's got the right to choose where they think they'll be safe." He gave a thin smile that sounded like wind through dead branches. "Since then, I can't stand a silent house. Reminds me there's no one left to talk to." Silence again. But this one felt different. Less heavy. More like something you could touch. It was the kind of quiet that exists between people who have both looked at the same flame and learned what it can do, how it warms and how it destroys. After a time, Mara asked softly, almost afraid to break the fragile peace, "So why did you let me stay? Aren't you afraid I'll leave too?" Elior lifted his head. Firelight shimmered in his eyes, deep and earthen, like soil after rain. "Because you never asked for pity." She frowned slightly, waiting. "Most who came here cried. he said. Begged or pretended to be weak. You didn't. You just asked if there was work. And He hesitated. I was tired of people who wanted saving. I needed someone who knew how to stand on her own. His words dropped into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of silence outward. Mara didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the lines in his wrist, the slope of his shoulder, where the fire's glow flickered warm. Then she leaned forward, slowly, without thought or reason, until the space between them was no more than a breath. Elior didn't move. The warmth of her body reached him, the mingled scent of smoke and skin pulling his heart into a rhythm it had forgotten. She stopped just short, her eyes clear in the firelight. You don't need to pity anyone, she said, voice rough but certain. But maybe you need someone who'll sit through a night like this without leaving. Elior wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He only nodded, slow and deliberate, a confession without sound. The flames leapt higher, brushing their faces in red-gold light. For a fleeting moment, it seemed there were two fires burning, one in the hearth, and one deep within his chest. Outside, the wind had gone still. Inside the old wooden house, silence glowed, no longer empty, but alive with breath and the space between two hearts learning to be warm again. The noon sun burned so dry that even the dust refused to rise. Elior was mending the western fence when he heard the slow, deliberate rhythm of hooves coming down the road. That sound, measured, heavy with intent, made his jaw tighten before the rider even came into view. Jack Brennan. The name still left a metallic taste in his mouth, like rust lodged in an old wound. Brennan reined in, tilted his hat, the corner of his mouth curling in a smile that never reached his eyes. Didn't think you'd hire a colored woman, he drawled. Guess loneliness makes a man flexible. The air thickened between them. Elior didn't answer. His hand brushed the grip of his gun, not to draw, only to remind himself that some things were still his to protect. Brennan saw the motion and chuckled. Careful, Grant. Folks around here don't forget where they think people belong. Then he turned his horse, kicking up dust and leaving that sentence hanging in the wind. When Elior turned back, Mara was standing on the porch. She had heard it all. Sunlight burned around her shoulders, turning the edges of her hair to gold. You didn't have to, she said quietly. Her voice didn't shake, but something weary lived in it. Elior set down the hammer, wiping his hands with slow precision. How does anyone get used to that? They say I pretend to be strong, she murmured. They don't know strength's the only thing that keeps you from breaking. He stepped closer. His gaze softened, though his voice still carried the chill of steel. You shouldn't fight alone. She gave a faint, almost tired smile. You shouldn't fight my battles. They're not yours alone, he said. The words hung there, light as dust, heavier than anything either had spoken before. Mara looked away first, and he let her go, no reaching out, no questions. By evening, the wind had cooled. Behind the barn, he found her setting up a wooden target. She held the same Winchester he'd taught her to use, the stock worn smooth by work, but still steady in her hands. I want to practice, she said without looking at him. He nodded. Keep your shoulder firm. Don't breathe when you pull. The first shot missed wide. She reloaded without pause, sweat tracing a line down her neck, gathering dust in its path. Elior stood back, silent, watching the shift of her shoulders. the quiet power beneath what once seemed fragile. The second shot grazed the edge. The third hit dead center. Mara lowered the rifle, exhaling, and turned. The last light of day crossed her face, catching the smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a small, unguarded smile. Elior didn't speak for a moment. Then, simply, "You're capable." She laughed softly. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the dry air like water. "That's not the same as pretty, is it?" she asked, half teasing, half searching. Elior froze. Words had never been his gift, especially when they stirred something that beat against the cage of his ribs. He only looked at her, long enough for her to blush faintly, turn away, and pretend to check the rifle's sights. But the look he gave her said everything he couldn't shape into sound. She understood, and said nothing. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of powder and scorched grass. They stood side by side, rifles still in hand, eyes fixed on the same horizon. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that thin stretch of space, close enough to feel each other breathe, far enough to stay whole. That night, Elior sat on the porch long after the lamps went out. The wind creaked through the eaves, whispering against the boards. He thought of her question, her smile, the way she stood steady beneath the weight of all she'd endured. Maybe, he thought, a man could forget how to be gentle, but he never forgets how to see beauty in someone still fighting to survive. That night, Montana lay white as an old dream. Snow blanketed the roof, the barn, the long road that vanished into the trees. Wind slipped through the cracks in the boards, carrying a cold that cut through skin. Elior was bracing the barn door, holding it against the storm, when Mara appeared, cloak heavy with snow, rope in hand. "You shouldn't do this alone," she said, her voice sharp against the wind. He started to argue, but one look from her silenced him. They pulled together, shoulder to shoulder, their breaths harsh in the freezing dark. The wind howled, the lantern's flame trembled, and their bodies strained against the storm. A plank snapped loose, striking her arm. She gasped, blood blooming red against the white. Elior caught her wrist. "Mara." "It's nothing," she said, though her lips had gone pale. "Inside. Now." He pulled her toward the house, the door slamming shut behind them, shutting out the roar. Inside, the fire burned steady. Its light washed over her skin, over the wet strands of hair clinging to her face. Elior fetched the salve and bandages, then knelt before her. "Your hand," he said quietly. She obeyed. His hands were rough, calloused, but they trembled when they touched her. Her skin was warm, alive, a contrast to the cold pressing against the walls. He cleaned the wound slowly, each movement careful, reverent, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. Every time his fingers brushed hers, she drew a shallow breath, and he felt it, like something pulling at his chest. She watched him. "You keep your distance," she whispered, "even when you care." He didn't answer. He finished wrapping her hand, the cloth white against her dark skin. She didn't pull away. "Mara," he said softly, half confession, half warning. She placed her uninjured hand over his chest. Beneath the thick wool, she could feel the strength of his heartbeat, fierce and uneven. "You don't have to be alone anymore, Elior," she said. Her voice was quiet, melting into the crackle of the fire. He looked at her through the glow. Her face was lit from below, eyes deep and sure, not pleading, not performing, just truth, bare and steady. His reply came slowly, like something long buried finding its way to air. "And you don't have to be strong all the time." Their breaths found each other. Neither knew who moved first. When their lips met, it wasn't haste or hunger. It was recognition. The silence between them turned soft, filled with the faint taste of smoke and snow and something that had waited too long. She touched his face, fingers tracing the thin scar along his jaw, learning it by feel. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. In that small, flickering space, the world outside, the rules, the color of skin, the weight of fear fell away like melting frost. No words followed, only the storm easing, the pop of wood in the fire, the warmth spreading through their joined hands. They stayed that way for a long time, letting quiet do the speaking. When the flames sank low, she rested her head against his shoulder. He tilted his own until it touched her hair, so slight a motion that to anyone watching, it might have seemed accidental. But to them it was surrender. Elior closed his eyes and listened to her breathing fall in rhythm with his. Outside, the snow kept falling, soundless. Inside the small wooden house, two people who had spent their lives surviving finally let the world fade away. And for the first time, they stopped pretending to be strong. Dawn did not come with sunlight that morning, but with smoke. Elior woke to the smell, sharp, unmistakable. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. He threw on his coat and burst outside. Across the field, the north barn was burning. Half the roof was gone, swallowed by red. The sound of cracking wood and panicked horses tore through the stillness. Embers danced into the gray sky, painting it the color of blood. "Mara!" he shouted, his voice raw. She ran from the porch, hair tied hastily, feet bare on the frozen earth. "I called for you. The fire spread too fast. Buckets! Anything that holds water, now!" They ran, breath and movement becoming one. Water splashed, hissed against flame, their shouts tangled with the roar of the fire. Sweat stung Elior's eyes, the taste of ash bitter on his tongue. He climbed the ladder, shovel in hand, striking at the burning boards, while Mara hauled water below, her voice hoarse, her rhythm sure. A spark flew, a single ember, and landed in her hair. For an instant, it flared. Elior jumped down without thinking. He dropped the shovel, grabbed her, pressed his hand against the smoldering strands until the glow died out. The smell of burnt hair rose, faint but real. Her skin darkened where the heat had kissed it. He kept hold of her too tightly, his chest heaving. "Elior, don't," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Don't talk." It wasn't an order, it was fear, raw and unhidden, not for himself, for her. They went on. Water, shovels, bare hands, determination. There was no line anymore between their bodies and the smoke, between pain and strength. When at last the fire gave in, shrinking to glowing fragments, breathing its last, they stood together, soaked, burned, trembling. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow, landing on their shoulders like forgiveness. Around them, only the hiss of cooling embers remained. Mara wiped a streak of soot from her cheek. "It's gone," she said quietly, eyes on the blackened frame. "Not all," Elior replied, voice unsteady but sure. "We saved the heart of it, and—" he hesitated, swallowing the ache. "We saved each other." She turned toward him. In her eyes, the reflection of the dying fire looked like stars. "You risked your life," she said, almost accusingly. Elior stepped closer, his hands still covered in ash. He touched her face, thumb brushing along her cheekbone. "You're my life now." The words were simple, but they struck her like thunder. Mara stood still, the cold forgotten. He didn't say it like a promise. He said it like something he had just remembered was true. She smiled faintly, exhausted yet radiant. "That's dangerous," she murmured. "Everything worth keeping is," he answered. The wind shifted, carrying the fading scent of smoke. They stayed there, two figures in the snow, hand in hand, black and white, heat and cold, opposites meeting in perfect balance. After a long while, she said, "The barn can be rebuilt." Elior looked at her, eyes softening. "I know. You'll probably tell me how to do it better." "Maybe," she said with a quiet laugh, "if you promise to listen." "Always." He meant it, not as a vow of obedience, but as a recognition. For the first time in years, his voice held warmth. The man who had once lived inside silence now had something worth speaking for. They turned back toward the house, steps slow, heavy with fatigue yet lighter somehow. Soot clung to their clothes, ash streaked their faces, but they carried something unburned inside them. Behind them, the embers glowed faintly under a thin veil of snow, not a threat, but a sign. A new fire had been lit, not to destroy, but to begin again. That evening, the wind carried the smell of smoke, not the kind born from grass or firewood, but from cheap tobacco, the sort only one man around here still used. Elior knew before he saw him. Jack Brennan rode in through the haze of sunset, his shadow stretching long across the field like an old scar torn open again. "Grant," he drawled, voice slurred just enough to sound casual, eyes too sharp to match. "Heard you've been having yourself a warm little winter." Elior said nothing. Brennan dismounted, dusting off his coat with lazy precision. A woman like that, dark and proud, don't usually stay where they're not wanted. Guess she found a way to pay her rent, huh? The words hit the ground like stones. No echo, just the ripples of anger spreading deep. Elior didn't remember moving, only that his hand had already seized Brennan's collar, shoving him back against the fence post. "You say one more word about her," he said, voice low, tight as thunder trapped in his chest, "and you'll choke on it." Brennan laughed, though blood darkened the corner of his mouth. "Touchy. Guess she's already got her claws in you. Thought you were too cold for that." Elior released him, jaw tight. "What do you want?" "Your land," Brennan replied, straightening his coat with a smirk. "Railroad's pushing west. I've got men, money, and friends in Helena who'd be happy to sign it over to me. Or—" His eyes slid toward the porch, where Mara stood framed by wind and fading light. "You can sell now. Keep your dignity. Wouldn't want her caught in the crossfire when the law gets messy." Mara didn't retreat. She stepped off the porch, the wind tugging at her coat, her hair glinting like a halo in the dying light. "Get off this land," she said, calm, steady. "We've got nothing for you." Brennan's tongue darted across his lips, a serpent's flick. "We'll see about that." He swung onto his horse and rode off, leaving behind only the bitter promise. "You'll wish you'd stayed alone, Grant." When the dust settled, Elior stayed still, his shoulders rigid. Mara walked to him and touched his arm. "Don't," she said softly. "He wants your anger. That's how men like him win." Elior nodded once, but the fury still burned behind his eyes. "He's not taking this ranch." "Then I fight with you." The words made him turn to her. "Mara, don't say it isn't my fight," she cut in, her tone quiet but fierce, the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. "I've worked this land. I've bled for it. I've bled for you." He had no answer. None that wouldn't sound smaller than the truth she had just spoken. As twilight deepened, they walked the boundary lines together. The air was heavy with the scent of ash and frost. The sky glowed a deep copper red, the color of iron before it cools. They moved in silence, two shadows bound by the same purpose, each carrying a rifle, each scanning the horizon for more than just danger. When they paused at the edge of the field, Mara spoke without turning. Her voice was low, even, like the ground itself. Temporary is just fear dressed up as reason. Elior looked at her. What? That's what you're doing, she said. Pretending this, me, us, all of it, is only for now. Makes it easier to walk away when it breaks. But it's not temporary anymore. Not since the day I came here. He said nothing. Her words sank through every defense he had built. The walls of solitude, the armor of caution, and lodged there, pulsing. The wind stirred the dry grass around them, carrying the faint scent of smoke and thawing earth. She turned her face toward the horizon, where the last line of sun burned red. If he comes back, we face him together. Elior's answer came quiet, certain. Together. They didn't need to say more. The wind moved between them, cool against their cheeks. The prairie stretched silent and endless, as if listening to a vow too private for words. When the sun finally sank, he glanced sideways. She was still standing straight, her eyes fixed on the dark line of land ahead. He didn't know what waited. Threats, fire, the law, or worse. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. Because fear now had a shape, and that shape was standing beside him, steady as the earth. The news came on a morning cold enough to turn breath into steel. The post rider left a sealed envelope from Helena, thick and red-stamped, and rode off before Elior could ask questions. He broke the seal slowly, eyes tracing each line. Every word landed heavy, like stones dropped into deep water, leaving no echo, only weight. Brennan was suing, accusing Elior of holding the land illegally, of misusing water rights. It was a familiar game. Bleed a man dry through paperwork until the ground gave what beneath him. How much? Mara asked. Elior folded the letter, voice low. Too much. How much exactly? He met her gaze. She didn't look away. 300 at least, just to start. I'll have to sell a few horses. How soon? By the end of the week. She nodded once, said nothing. That afternoon, while Elior worked the stables, she was gone. A note waited on the table in her careful handwriting. Going to town. Back by sundown. He stood there for a long while, the clock ticking in the empty kitchen. Part of him worried. The rest of him understood. She was doing what she always did, what needed to be done. When the light began to fade, he heard hooves returning. Mara rode in, her cloak streaked with dust, her hair tangled by wind, but her smile was small and certain. She set a small leather pouch on the table. It clinked faintly when it landed. Enough, she said. For the court. Elior looked from her to the pouch. Mara? She avoided his eyes, pulling off her gloves. I sold my wedding ring. He froze. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft hum of wind in the chimney. Robert's ring? He asked quietly. She nodded. Her tone was calm, almost gentle. I kept it to remember, but memory doesn't need gold. He stepped closer, his hand half raised before he caught himself. You shouldn't have. It was just metal, she said, a faint smile curving her lips. This. Her eyes moved around the room, the fire, the land beyond the window. This is home. Something caught in his throat. He wasn't a man given to sentiment, but as he looked at her, dust on her coat, cracked hands, eyes steady even after giving away the last piece of her past, he found words small and useless. Only one truth mattered. He took her hand, holding it tight, as though letting go might undo everything they had built. "Mara," he said, voice rough, "let's make it official. Not for the law, for the life we already have." Her breath caught. "Elior." He swallowed hard, speaking slowly, stripped of everything except honesty. "I called this place home, but it's not the land. It's you." The quiet that followed felt like a lifetime. Then she smiled, fragile, radiant, breaking open like sunlight through frost. Tears fell, unhurried, unhidden. "God help us both," she whispered. "Yes." Elior brushed a thumb across her cheek. "First time I've seen you cry." "Don't get used to it," she said, voice trembling with laughter. He smiled, softly, a rare thing. "If it's for this, I could." She laughed through her tears. There were no flowers, no vows, no music, just two hands clasped together in the fading light, with ashes from the old barn scattered across the yard, and snow beginning to fall again, light and patient, as if offering its quiet blessing. That night, when the fire burned low, Elior found a strip of leather from his saddle gear. He looped it around her finger, the rough edge dark against her skin. "No gold," he said, "but something stronger." "What's that?" she asked softly. "Intention," he replied. "The one thing no one can take." Mara looked down at the makeshift ring, then back at him. "Then we start again," she said. He nodded. "From this house, from this life." She tilted her head, voice faint as wind. "I never needed flowers. Just a place where I could stop surviving." Elior placed his hand over her heart, feeling its slow, steady rhythm. "Then stay," he said. "Stay and live." And in the stillness of that winter night, neither spoke again. Because everything that needed saying had already been said, in the loss of an old ring and the birth of a promise meant to last. Word of their marriage traveled faster than the Montana wind. Within 3 days, by the time Elior and Mara reached Helena to file their license, the whispers had already settled into every saloon, every dry goods store, every church pew where people pretended at virtue each Sunday morning. "They say Mr. Grant married his colored housekeeper. Man's gone mad." And from the lips of a few women, half envy, half spite, came quieter words. "Or maybe he found something we never had the courage to look for." Mara heard every murmur. She didn't lower her head. She walked beside Elior, wearing a plain brown dress, the leather cord around her finger catching the weak winter light. Every step she took down the dirt street was a quiet defiance, a proof that dignity could speak louder than reputation. Elior, who'd never cared for talk before, was unusually silent that day. He heard the whispers, felt them circle like dust around his boots, but said nothing. When Mara's hand tightened around his, he simply tightened back. At the courthouse, the clerk, a balding man with pale eyes, looked between them, pen hovering. "Mr. Grant," he said carefully, "are you certain about this?" Elior met his gaze without hesitation. "I've never been more certain of anything." Then he looked at Mara, a small, quiet smile breaking through. "And it's Mrs. Grant now." She smiled back, and for a moment, even the dust motes in the sunlight seemed to pause. There were no flowers, no witnesses, just sunlight spilling through the window and the sound of two names written side by side on one piece of paper. Later that afternoon, they stopped at the town saloon to buy supplies before the ride home. The door creaked as they entered, and the golden light of late day followed them inside. The low hum of cards and chatter faded. Men looked up from their poker tables, silence stretching thick as molasses. Elior placed a steady hand at the small of Mara's back and walked to the counter. "Whiskey, 2 bottles, and some flour." The shopkeeper nodded awkwardly, fumbling with the order. The hush held until a voice from the corner, drawling, sour, unmistakable, split it open. "Well, if it ain't the man who traded his name for a pair of dark hands." Mara froze. Elior turned. Jack Brennan sat slouched in the corner, a half-empty bottle swinging from his hand, eyes bloodshot, smile crooked. "Tell me, Grant," he sneered, "did she cook you love, or did you just run out of white women to save?" No one laughed. No one moved. Even the piano stopped mid-note. Elior crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was calm, dangerously calm. "Say her name." Brennan blinked, feigning confusion. "What?" "Say her name," Elior repeated, his voice low as thunder before it breaks. "If you're going to talk about her, you'll use her name." Brennan's grin widened, cracked, bitter. "Fine. Mara." The punch landed before the word did. It was not wild, not loud, just clean, final. The sound of flesh meeting bone, the end of a long-held restraint. Brennan hit the floor, chair splintering, bottle shattering into amber shards. No one spoke. Elior didn't move again. He stood over the man, chest rising and falling, eyes steady, not proud, just done. When he turned, Mara was still by the door. Her eyes held no fear, only something quieter. Understanding, sorrow, and a pride she didn't need to explain. He walked toward her. Blood glistened at his knuckles. She reached for his hand, wiped it clean with the edge of her sleeve. "Did you have to?" she asked softly. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "Not for me. For you." She didn't answer. Instead, she took his hand and led him outside. Behind them, the silence of the room remained, but a few men nodded. Not approval, not judgment, just acknowledgement. Outside, the sky burned crimson. Clouds turned the color of rusted iron, the valley beneath washed in molten light. Elior breathed deep, the scent of earth and mountain wind filling his lungs. "The valley protects its own now," he said quietly. Mara looked toward the fading sun, her voice low but certain. "It always did. It just needed someone to believe in it again." They walked on side by side, their shadows long against the dust road, merging as the last light fell. The man who had once lived by silence now had someone who heard him. And the woman who had once lived by pride now had a place where her name could stand unshaken, spoken, and finally honored. That winter came early. Clouds rolled down from the mountains, thick and heavy, laying over the valley like a woolen blanket. Snow buried the trails, the roof, the new barn they had built, until the world seemed to belong to no one but them. Elior and Mara rose before dawn each day. They hauled hay, boiled water, fed the fire. The crackle of kindling marked the rhythm of their new life. Mara pulled on her gloves, ran her fingers through the horses' manes, murmuring to them as though to small, waiting souls. Elior watched her through the fog of his own breath, sometimes half believing she couldn't be the same woman who'd once knocked on his door in a blizzard, asking only for work. She had changed this place. The kitchen, once cold, now smelled of bread and coffee. The bedroom, once stark, was warm beneath the quilt she'd sewn from the scraps of her old dress. Even the wooden walls, which he had thought long dead, now seemed to breathe, softly humming whenever the wind passed through the gaps. Some days the snow came too heavy to step outside. Mara would sit by the window, mending clothes, while Elior sharpened his tools at the table. The sound of steel on stone fell into rhythm with the ticking of the clock, two hearts beating inside a house that no longer felt hollow. When she grew tired, he set a hand on her shoulder to remind her to rest. When he bent to feed the fire, she reached to straighten his scarf. Those small gestures, wordless, ordinary, became the language of their love. One evening, the wind rose stronger than before. The back door slammed open, and the fire jumped high in the hearth. Mara set her sewing aside and went to the window. Outside, the storm swept across the valley, scattering snowflakes that caught the lamplight like stars. She felt the house tremble faintly, heard the wind hum through the chimney, the timbers creaking, a sound both fragile and fierce. Elior came to stand beside her, wrapping a coat around her shoulders. "Storm's strong tonight," he said. She nodded, eyes on the swirling white beyond the glass. "But it sounds different." "How?" "Like it's singing, not breaking." He turned to hers. The lamp's glow caught her face, the curve of her cheek, the dark warmth of her eyes reflecting the fire behind them. She smiled. "The house sounds alive." Elior brushed her hand lightly, his own rough and chilled. "That's because it finally is." She leaned her head against his shoulder, breath warm against his neck. The storm howled on, but inside the house there was only the quiet thrum of their heartbeats and the soft complaint of the timbers. Two rhythms, once separate, now keeping time together. That night, they lay side by side on the old wooden bed. Mara fell asleep first, her hand still resting loosely in his. Elior stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind. For years, that sound had haunted him. It had always meant emptiness, reminder of a life too quiet. Now it was only background to warmth. He turned slightly, fingers brushing the leather cord she still wore instead of a ring. She stirred but didn't let go. Outside, the blizzard carried on, wild and endless. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, no longer fierce, no longer desperate, but sure. It glowed with the same quiet endurance as the two of them, built by hand, tended by patience, and proof that the past could not steal this winter from them. By morning, the sky was pale silver. Elior rose before the light and stepped out onto the porch. Snow reached his ankles, crisp and clean, untouched. The air bit at his skin, but his chest felt warm, each breath turning to soft clouds that drifted upward and vanished. Behind him, he heard her footsteps. Mara came out, a blanket draped around her shoulders. Without a word, she wrapped it around him too, resting her head against his back. Together they stood there, facing the horizon as the sun climbed over the ridge. Its first light touched the fields, turning the snow to a scatter of mirrors bright and alive. Behind them, the house creaked softly in the wind, breathing like a living thing. And for the first time, Elior realized peace didn't come with silence. It came when silence had someone else's breath in it. Spring came without fanfare. No trumpet of birds, no sudden bloom. Just the first morning when Elior felt the snow soften under his boots, turning to water, and when the sunlight touched it, thin mist rose like ghosted smoke. The fields opened, tender and green, like skin after a wound has healed. On the hill, Mara stood waiting, a sapling in her hands wrapped at the roots with coarse cloth. She wore a simple blouse, collar open to the morning light. The air smelled of wet soil and new grass. The wind caught a few strands of her hair and brushed them across her cheek. "Ready?" she asked. Elior nodded, taking the shovel. They dug together. The ground was damp, cold, but forgiving. Each stroke of the shovel made a soft, steady sound that hung in the wide stillness around them. He opened the hollow. She set the sapling in place. Together, they pressed the earth down, firm and sure, then stood back to watch it tremble gently in the wind, like something just beginning to breathe. "Elm," Elior murmured. "It'll be tall enough to shade the porch in a few years." "And its roots will find water," Mara said, her voice like a quiet prayer. They smiled at each other. They didn't need to say it, but both knew they weren't just planting a tree. They were planting their lives again. Mara sat on the porch steps, brushing dirt from her hands. "You built this house for someone else once," she said softly, almost as if to herself. "Didn't you?" Elior stood still. The dawn light caught the brown in his hair, turning it to copper. He looked toward the house. The patched walls, the mismatched stones, the places where her hands had fixed and mended until the whole thing felt alive again. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but it was always waiting for you." She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was peace there now, not as something to chase, but something already theirs. She knew he meant it, because this house carried traces of them both. In the hinge that creaked softly, in the scent of bread and wood smoke, in the quilt she'd sewn, in the leather cord he had tied around her finger that winter night. Elior sat beside her, his hands still rough with soil. "Funny," he said. "I used to think I'd die here alone. Then you walked in like I'd been told to wait." Mara tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then I hope you waited long enough to know it was worth it." He looked at her, steady and full, every day. They sat for a long time, backs resting against each other, watching the sun climb over the ridge. Light spilled across the damp field, sliding over blades of grass, rising up the porch posts, and finding the window where they'd once seen each other for the first time. A soft breeze brushed the sapling, its tiny branches whispering like the breath of something newborn. Mara spoke, half to him, half to the sky. "It's strange. I used to think peace meant silence, but now..." Hisaval turned. "Now. It sounds like this." Elior took her hand, not tight, just enough to keep it. His weathered palm, her calloused fingers, two lives once splintered now held together in light. The house on the hill stood firm among the new grass. The wind passed through its wooden seams, not howling, but humming, like a familiar tune remembered after years of forgetting. When the sun finally rose in full, Elior spoke, quietly, as if to the past itself. For years, the house stood silent. He turned to her, a small smile warming his voice. Until she walked in. Mara finished it, eyes bright in the morning glow. And it remembered how to breathe. They fell into silence. Above them, The first birds of spring swept over the valley, shadows gliding across the porch, across the sapling, across the roof that had sheltered so many storms. The house caught the new light and seemed to exhale, warm, alive, free. Once it had been only wood and nails. Once he had been only a man surviving the wind. Once she had been a woman carrying ghosts. Now they stood in the same light, and love needed no words, only the quiet proof of what they'd built together. Maybe each of us, in time, will find a house like Elior and Mara's, not always made of timber or stone, but of a heart once locked, now opened by someone patient enough to step inside. Their story held no grand vows, only two hands that kept holding through winter, rebuilding what once seemed lost. And if you've ever sat through loneliness, listening to wind against your walls, you'll understand why the house breathed again when she entered. Because love, at any age, is never too late to return. Thank you for joining Wild West Love Stories on the journey of Elior and Mara, two souls small against the wide wind, yet brave enough to stay, to begin again, and to call it home. If their story touched your heart, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and tap like or subscribe to walk with us through more gentle tales of the West, where love always finds its way back, no matter the season.